All right, so I've been tasked with telling you how drugs affect the brain. As a matter of introduction, my area of expertise is neuropharmacology, and I spent the best part of my life investigating the cellular actions of substances of abuse, in particular cocaine. Today, I'm tasked with telling you what the effects of drugs that we abuse often have on the brain. And I'll try. Yay, something is not right. How does this work? Okay, so I would start with an introduction where I would go through the commonly abused drugs, how these drugs affect the brain, and how they eventually affect the health of the individual and the society. And I will end with a summary and conclusion. Let me apologize in advance that I prepared my presentation in the background that I wanted, but the organizers wanted it on their background. So there are some changes in the outline and the way things are presented. So bear with me as I go through it. To start with, I need to tell you a very brief story about the genesis of this problem. Around 2000, the Neuroscience Society of America commissioned a huge study on substance abuse. And at the end of that study, they concluded with a series of reviews by the world experts in substance abuse. And one of the concluding statements simply said that although our brains evolved to respond not to drugs, so our brains evolved to respond not to drugs, but to natural rewards such as food and sex, which are necessary for survival and reproduction of the human race. We as human beings discovered how to stimulate this system artificially with drugs. In other words, we as humans, or even animals, are endowed with an ability to experience pleasure. And anytime we have the opportunity to do that, we jump at it. And therefore, all drugs that we use often will tap into this natural ability to produce the effects that are either immediately pleasurable or consequently lead to changes in your behavior. Okay. Now I need my glasses to see. Okay. So, addiction is defined as a chronic and relapsing brain disorder or disease that is characterized by compulsive drug-seeking behavior. So it is chronic, it is relapsing. In other words, you don't always have to use it, but it can go and come as the need arises or as the situation presents itself. And it is not something that the individual controls. It is compulsive. So your initial experience is often experimental. Individuals go into it as a matter of experiment, and then they degenerate into compulsive use. Notice that it's defined as a disease, and therefore it needs treatment. Now, the biggest challenge that you would face would be to determine who is an addict in your society. Scientifically, when do we say an individual is addicted? The individual is said to be an addict when they are unable to control the amount of drug they use, when they show irresistible cravings and or urge for the substance, and they continue to use the substance despite the adverse effects that the individual experiences. More importantly, the individual may deny that they actually have the problem, and they have a tendency to abuse other mood-altering drugs. And this is important, that an individual who is addicted to one substance has a tendency to abuse other mood-altering drugs. And this is the crux of the matter, that often individuals don't start abusing the hard drugs that are actually criminalized. You start with the soft drugs that are legal. And then, because they almost always occur together, you degenerate into using them concurrently. They exhibit tolerance, where they have to increase the amount of drug taken to derive the initial pleasure levels. And they exhibit withdrawal signs and symptoms when they are deprived of the drug. When you see these things in an individual, then they are said to be an addict. What are the drugs that are commonly abused? I would quickly go through them, but I believe the previous speakers have addressed some of them. And there are two categories. There are those that are illicit. It means they are illegal to use in the society that you find yourself. Some societies define certain drugs as illegal, others accept them as legal. And you will see that some of them are listed in both categories. So the illicit ones are the psychostimulants that have absolutely no medicinal use, and therefore their use is often purely for producing the pleasure or relieving the discomfort that the individual feels. These include amphetamines and methamphetamine-like compounds, crack and cocaine. Narcotics have certain uses in the clinics for pain, but there are some derivatives of narcotics that are not used clinically at all, but that find themselves being abused by individuals. For example, people may be addicted or people may abuse opiates such as morphine or heroin, tramadol, fentanyl, cannabinoids, also known as marijuana, other CNS depressants such as alcohol, which may or may not be illegal in your society, psychotropic agents such as LSD, DOM, and psilocybin. The illicit ones are alcohol, again depending on your society, nicotine, hypnosedatives such as benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and propofol. Opioids, again, such as morphine, heroin, tramadol, and fentanyl. And gabapentinoids, these are the latest group of substances that are prone to abuse, such as pregabalin, called Lyrica, and gabapentin or Neurontin. These drugs have street names, and I believe the previous speakers have addressed those street names adequately, so I don't have to belabor the point. Just as you know that on the street, different drugs would be called by different names, and once you are familiar with them, you know the language, and you have to understand that. So, how do these drugs work on the brain? Again, as this group of preeminent neuroscientists and substance abuse researchers put it, that our brains have evolved to enjoy or to derive pleasure. We have an endowed ability to derive pleasure. So when we eat food and we enjoy it, when you engage in certain activities that are pleasant, is because your brain is endowed with the ability to express those pleasurable effects. So, most of the drugs that actually are abused often target the brain's reward system. That system that enables you to derive pleasure from eating, that enables you to enjoy music, that enables you to engage in sexual activity, and so on and so forth. Those pleasurable activities that human beings engage in. That system is part of your brain network system, and it is called the reward system. I'll be talking details about that. And this system is driven predominantly by a neurotransmitter called dopamine. Drugs hijack this brain decision-making system, such as the orbitofrontal cortex, leading to fixated or habitual behaviors that would drive you into repeated use and repeated use would eventually lead you to becoming an addict because your system would adjust to the presence of the drug, and therefore you will constantly strive to use that compound. And this often is no longer voluntary, it becomes compulsive. You no longer have the self-will to override the use. You are driven by an endogenous system that is run out of control. So this is the system. Again, pardon the change in the detail because it's been transformed from my background to this background. But this is called the mesolimbic mesocortical dopamine system. And the main brain regions involved in this are down here is the VTA. I think this pointer is not working. So towards this, there's the VTA. That's the source of dopamine in the mesolimbic mesocortical dopamine system, and it provides an input into the prefrontal cortex, or what we call the limbic cortices, exemplified by the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus, and a huge input to the nucleus accumbens. The limbic cortices provide a very huge excitatory drive into the nucleus accumbens, so the nucleus accumbens serves as the integrator of this function, whereby it takes information from the VTA and from the limbic cortex, integrates it, and sends out an output, which is in the form of your behavior. There is an input here that actually is not showing up because of color issues, but this is from what we call the PPTG and the LDTG. These are also tegmental areas, but that is acetylcholinergic, and that is the input that derives nicotine addiction into this system. So as you can see, a lot of your substances of abuse simply tap into this mesolimbic mesocortical dopamine system to generate pleasure. And under normal use, that process is moderated and under biological control. When you use exogenous substances that are not naturally present in your body, then you lose that ability to control it naturally, and then you degenerate into an addict. So this here shows, again, the system. Your VTA is right there, and it supplies the limbic cortices and the nucleus accumbens, and that network basically then drives the behavior that we call reward. So anytime you want to derive pleasure, you basically would be tapping into this system. The important regions are the VTA, the nucleus accumbens, and the limbic cortices, exemplified by the prefrontal cortex. Sorry, something is, yips, I think it's skipping. Hey, okay. So, long-term drug abuse impairs the ability of these higher cortical regions to function normally. During highs, you have severe alteration in behavior. The limbic system controls complex behaviors, including mental behaviors, and can lead to mental disorders such as mania and schizophrenic symptoms. You have an inability to learn, and this is driven by the effects on your cognitive system. There's cognitive decline because you have overridden the natural processes that control them. So the neuroadaptations in the limbic circuits will be responsible for your inability to learn because you cannot readjust your system to take in new information and to process it properly. You have poor decision-making process whereby the individual is not able to make decisions as and when it's necessary. So executive function is critically impaired, and this again is driven by the orbitofrontal cortex. Even though a lot of these drugs are initially used to derive pleasure. After some time, you begin to derive diminished pleasure because you have driven the system into a situation where you have a negative feedback, and these individuals may often show flat affect and depressed mood. And this often would be seen in individuals who would binge, and immediately following the binge use of the drug, they become depressed. Continued use to experience elusive previous level of pleasure, again, that is due to the tolerance. So the individual is constantly looking for the very first time they used it and the experience they gained during that first time, and they will never get it. The idea then is they attempt to compensate for that initial level by increasing the dose. And when they increase the dose, they use more. Problem is that different body organs have different dose response curves to different drugs. So when you increase the dose to derive pleasure in the brain, that dose may be lethal to the heart. And that is where overdoses occur when individuals or addicts turn to increase the dose in order to attempt to derive the initial level of pleasure that they got when they first tried it. So drugs of addiction erodes the person's self-control and their ability to make sound decisions while producing intense impulse to take the drug. Then the individual craves for the drug. And this craving is actually the most difficult element of the addiction process. You may be able to manage the physical withdrawal symptoms, but the craving is extremely difficult to reverse, and that usually underlies relapse. So, naturally, this I took from Google Images. Your brain, under the influence of drugs, almost looks like fried egg. When you crack an egg and it is nice, and you drop it into a hot basin with oil, you fry it, and that's what your brain looks like. Okay? So, how does this, something is skipping. I think I'm missing a few slides because there was, see? Something skipped. Okay, from here, all right. So, one of the tasks I really wanted to do today was to explain to individuals, because I think the audience is cross-sectional. There are scientists and non-scientists as well, so I thought I would spend a little bit of time explaining how, at the cellular level, drugs affect the brain. Some of these drugs, such as marijuana and heroin, nicotine, they directly activate receptors. In other words, they mimic receptors that are endogenous. They are part of your system. There are transmitters that utilize those receptors. For example, marijuana would activate cannabinoid receptors. Heroin will activate your opioid receptors. Nicotine will activate your nicotinic acetylcholine receptors to produce the effects that you desire. Others, such as amphetamines and cocaine, cause neurons to release abnormally large amounts of dopamine, and this is the crux of the matter. When you release that abnormally large amount, your body or your system is no longer able to control the level of pleasure and to maintain it for a long time. So you release a large amount of dopamine and other biogenic amines by preventing either the normal recycling process, like prevent the reuptake. Cocaine and amphetamine prevent the reuptake. Amphetamine would both prevent reuptake and force the release. So when you do that, you flood the system with dopamine, and you end up with a situation where your brain is literally on fire. Okay? Others directly modify or enhance the critical receptors. Again, for example, barbiturates and benzodiazepines and alcohol all affect the GABA B receptor, the GABA A receptor. They modify the ability of this receptor to transmit information and therefore to modify or change the processes that control behavior in the reward system. Others block ion channels. So today, we know that there are drugs that are abused that act directly on ion channels. Examples are the gabapentinoids, gabapentin and pregabalin. We know they affect a channel subunit or calcium channel subunit leading to alteration in transmitter release, therefore underlying their effects. And as you can see, these effects can occur at any or all of the brain regions that I mentioned in the mesolimbic, mesocortical dopamine system. So effects can occur both in the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area, and you can see what kind of drugs affect where. The effect can be presynaptic, the effects can be postsynaptic, the effects can be both. So these drugs all affect the system predominantly driven by the dopamine system. So the VTA is an important area of action of substance of self-abuse. The nucleus accumbens is an important area. The prefrontal cortex is important, although that is not depicted in this picture. So all these effects, whether it is direct receptor activation, whether it is enhancement in transmitter release, and in this case, predominantly dopamine, because dopamine is a transmitter that drives the process, or it is modulation of GABAergic inputs or channels on the GABAergic neurons. All these are part and parcel of the neural circuitry that controls the reward pathway. So you can intercept the process at any of these levels to produce an alteration in the reward process. And the difference, again, between the use of natural stimulants, such as food, to derive pleasure, and the use of exogenous substances to derive the same pleasure, is simply that in the presence of food, dopamine level is very much controlled, and therefore the body is able to accommodate that change. Whereas if you use cocaine, which is exogenous to the body, you flood the system with dopamine, and the system then becomes uncontrollable. And that's why we say at this point, your brain is almost on fire, and you are likely to exhibit schizophrenic or manic behavior because you have exaggerated the dopaminergic response in the reward system. And as it turns out, this same reward system is also responsible for complex behaviors that are often disturbed in schizophrenics. I think this skipped earlier, so I'll just skip this slide because I've addressed this issue here and that. So, what then is the effect of a drug on the health of the individual or the health of the society? I think this is important for the audience to know that when an individual uses or abuses a drug, it not only affects him as a person, but it may actually cross over and affect the society. And I'll try and walk through a few of these issues with you. An individual who is an addict is more likely to commit a crime. I hope the lawyers and the social scientists who spoke earlier alluded to these facts. The altered state of the mind, e.g. when you use marijuana or other hallucinogens, such as PCP and LSD, would make this individual not able to tell the difference between right and wrong, and they would be driven to commit crime. Also, when they withdraw, or in the absence of the drug, when they are exhibiting the physical withdrawal symptoms, it is so unpleasant to them that they are happy to steal, which is a crime. They are happy to rob, that is, to use arms to obtain the drug. So they are not just petty thieves, but they can be armed robbers who would do anything to obtain the drug. And this is responsible for a lot of gang warfare in the United States and other places like Colombia, Mexico, and a whole unit in the US government is tasked with dealing with this issue. It's a drug enforcement agency. Also, people who are addicts often would be under or would drive under the influence of a drug, and they will have erratic vehicular operation, especially when they are on stimulants or on depressants. Either way, they will end up being a problem to the society. You're driving your car, minding your own business, and somebody cuts in front of you, or somebody bumps you from behind, and instances arise where people may die due to road traffic accidents, and so on and so forth. So a lot of road traffic accidents have been traced back to drug abuse. Either it's alcohol or cocaine or amphetamines and so on and so forth. And of course, today's day and age is not a drug, but the telephone is included in the increase in road traffic accidents, because people try to text and do all sorts of things with two phones while driving with their legs, and that can lead to accidents. Secondly, an addict is more likely to get psychiatric disorders. In fact, in the lab, we use some of these drugs as models for schizophrenia. So to study schizophrenia in a lab, I can give an animal amphetamines or cocaine, and they would exhibit the same signs and symptoms of an individual who has taken cocaine. And a good fraction of psychiatric patients have experimented at one stage of their lives. They have experimented on a hard drug. And when I say hard drugs, those are the drugs that are illegal across the board: cocaine, amphetamines, and so on and so forth. So they often would have experimented on those drugs. Secondly, substance abuse is almost always a comorbidity with psychiatric disorders. Either the substance abuse drives them to become psychotic or psychiatric, or the psychiatric disorder drives them to become substance abusers. Either way, they almost always coexist. And substance abuse may trigger frequent relapses. So for an individual who is got a psychiatric problem and has been controlled adequately by medications, often when they relapse, it is because they have relapsed to alcohol, or to drug abuse. That then drives the psychiatric relapse. Overdose is often a problem. Like I said, various organs of your body have different dose response curves to a drug. Dopamine is not only present in the brain, it is also present in your periphery, and is important as a transmitter in controlling your cardiovascular system. But the dose response curve for dopamine in your brain is different than it is for the vascular system. So when you raise the dose of dopamine to derive the pleasure in the brain may take it, but that would be a lethal dose for the cardiovascular system. So a lot of drug addicts often would eventually overdose and die from that cardiovascular effect. Also, the problem with the overdose or difficulty to treat, especially when you have certain patients, is that there is what we call cross-tolerance between these drugs, such that when an individual is addicted to, say, alcohol, this individual is extremely difficult to anesthetize because of the cross-tolerance between the cocaine and time. Okay. So we'll be finishing soon. The morbidity of lost work at your workplace. There's malnourishment as for the individual, and direct toxicity to the individual, and indirect toxicity in the form of malnutrition, and such as in alcoholics, you get both protein energy malnutrition and non-protein energy malnutrition. Of course, there is a secondary effect of cigarette smoking and other drugs on the society. And the good news is, do not try to experiment, because when you use it once, the insult is permanent. There is evidence that once you use it, you have already given yourself the trigger for it to last forever. And the good news, of course, is if you stop immediately, there's a chance to recover. This here shows the brain of an individual who is healthy and the brain of a drug abuser. We just, measuring the dopamine transporter here. And this individual, if they take treatment or if they stop, you can see that they move back towards the normal brain. This is 1 month abstinence. This is 14 months abstinence. So if you stop early, you will be able to recover. And finally, there are treatments available. There are treatments available both with drugs and psychotherapy. You can engage yourself in one or both at the same time. There is no cure yet, and the likelihood of this disease, or we now call it a disease, to be treated is not that good, and therefore we must be prepared to address it as a chronic case. So use your limbic system for rewards that are natural and not for substance abuse. Thank you very much.